and stuff gets thrown up from the bottom of that river twice a day, every day, and Tudor stuff mixed with Victorian stuff, mixed with Roman stuff, everywhere. So people go out at low tide looking for stuff, having metal detectors, collecting things, and if they find anything terribly interesting, the Museum of London Archaeological Services goes out and investigates. And it's really, really fast, because when the tide comes in, it all moves again. So we get some interesting block lifts coming into the museum, and I started working with waterlogged leather. So a block lift is where you kind of know there's something scary and delicate, so you just slice around it and bring the whole chunk of dirt to the lab. First thing that we do is tend to x-ray them to see if we can figure out if there's anything x-rayable in there. And as you can see, there are some really cool kind of cleats. It's hobnail shoes. So excavating that, we had some iron material there, and then we had leather. So wet leather is tricky, and because it's tricky and it smells bad and it takes months and months and months to be able to impregnate it with polyethylene glycol in these wet baths, and you keep opening them and checking to see how much the leather has absorbed this kind of plasticky material while it's still wet. And once it's kind of hit this stable zone after a few months or sometimes a few years, you're able to then vacuum freeze dry the object, and then it is kind of shelf stable to be able to be reshaped and put on display. And the whole process is very stinky. Wet leather is kind of like moldy, and you're putting this basically sugar water petri dish situation and then letting it bathe for months. So not everybody is into that. And the fascination, though, of being able to find 2,000-year-old leather shoes and be able to put them on display like this when they came out of the river, it kind of became my thing. So the mystery blocks that would come in from the archaeological services became like my special jam. You see a mystery block over there. I excavated it. I found that wooden bucket that you see up top there, cleaned it out, impregnated it with polyethylene glycol. You see it in the freeze dryer chamber right there, and it's now beautifully on display. But bonus, I also found a copper cauldron under there. So in that chunk of dirt, oh yeah, you gave me this. Over here, there's a hidden copper cauldron. There it is. It was beautiful. So this idea of being able to preserve things that seem unpreservable or find information in almost nothing. Marine concretions become also another cool thing. So it was kind of the leather guy for a couple years, and then these mystery chunks of corroded iron. If you look at this x-ray, so chunk of corroded iron, bagged and tagged from a dive, you kind of start to see these roundy things in there, maybe a line right there of like, it's a chain. I broke it open on the edge, kind of on that side, and there was nothing but a hole. So all of the iron had just massively corroded out, and there was nothing but a hole where the object used to be. So I filled it with resin, and I cracked it open like a little magic egg, and slowly but surely I was able to reconstruct the chain just from resin that I poured into those gaps. And being able to keep that three-dimensional measurement intact, I could give really, really good information to the ship nerds who could tell you when this was manufactured and where, just based on those dimensions. So the object was completely gone, but we were still able to extract that information. Moving on from the waterlogged everythings, I started to become really obsessed with salts. Soluble salts, salt water gets into objects, but especially with metals, they'll have reactions where it then crystallizes insoluble salts on the objects that you can't get out with water anymore, and it'll start to rip the actual physical object apart. So these sorts of specialized extreme environment issues, they're complicated, they're a pain in the butt, many of them smell bad, but that fascination with, okay, what kind of information can I retrieve from this? This is me working at the Maryland Archaeological Conservation Lab. We had a whole bunch of stuff from the Chesapeake Bay, and we had this massive setup of electrolytic reduction cells, which is another way to sort of create a battery out of the object and remove those salts. Just kind of getting you into this whole extreme environments require extreme solutions, kind of, their solutions, a little bit of production. Anyway. Moving back to London, architecture, kind of not my thing, but weird situations are my thing. Chedworth Roman Villa is a site out kind of by Wales, and England is wet, and this place was built on a spring, so they have this beautiful freshwater spring. It's got a little fountain. That means the water table is very, very high. It's right up to the floor level. So everything stays wet. So these in situ mosaics are beautiful, but they're constantly wet. So being able to conserve them and keep them stabilized so that they could build a museum over this floor, you can't glue things because the glue will never dry because nothing ever dries. Those stones are always wet. So being able to play with different kinds of adhesives that only work with certain solvents like ethanol and acetone, but have no sort of response to water, we were able to actually create these little stitch patches that you can see there, because it doesn't have a whole lot of hold surface. So we've got these little Japanese tissue stitches holding those on. And then we covered it up and used sand as sort of the weight on top. And they were able to construct a modern building on top of that while they stayed wet. And then we have the floating wet mosaics. They had a hypocaust system, so they had underfloor heating, which is so fancy. 2,000 years ago, 2 sets of underfloor heating. We had the air systems where they would just make fires in the corner, and so hot air would be going down there. And then in this hallway, it was the hot water from the springs. So it's really wet under there, and it's also super empty underneath. So we couldn't use that weighted sand method and had to do float mounts. So the normal sort of mosaic conservation was really secondary to this wet extreme environment situation, and it became a solid chemistry question. It became a bit of a MacGyver, what are the properties of the object that we're looking for, and then we go find it, right? There's kind of not a good handbook for the extreme environments because that's not what we learned, I guess, in school, because museum objects don't work that way. Archaeology is all about the dirt, the matrix that the objects are in, as those sort of major factors. All right, so dry environment. So extreme wet, extreme salty wet. How about dry? Hey, it's Mark. Working out in the desert environments, you know that things are preserved really, really well, right? We've got the mummies, we've got all kinds of organic objects from ancient Egypt, because that hot, dry environment is really, really good for preservation. But the minute you take things out of that super stable burial environment and then you put them in an air-conditioned museum, terrible things happen. So, back to London, I had this 6,000-year-old Egyptian basket that had gotten warped, pieces had broken, and it started to swell. So you have these reeds from the Nile, and they're all these long, slim, beautiful things that have never gotten wet in their lives. And when they moved to London to be at the Petrie Museum, that moisture and that humidity swells the individual fibers of that plant material, and it gets short and fat and starts to pull itself apart. I can't change the environment in London, but I can sort of create some supports for that object to be able to survive in that environment. Should it go back to Cairo? No, because then it'll have to dry out again and have all of its problems back, right? So stable, even if different, if we can make it get used to its new home in London with a little bit of help, let's see, there we go. No, so there's little stitches on there. It's a little bit of a Where's Waldo, but they are watercolor dyed pieces of Japanese tissue that I made into little tiny threads, and then with tweezers and microscopes, just kind of made little like joint cuffs around each of those sets of reed fibers that were starting to pull apart. Now that it's stable in London, it's going to be quite happy there for the rest of its life. What about out on site again? Here we are in Çatalhöyük, which is the South Desert of Turkey. We have this huge excavation that's many acres, it's open and it's an ongoing process, and they built this wonderful massive tent over it so that we can leave it open all year long. People can come tour it, researchers can come and interpret this 8,000-year-old urban settlement. It's like, we went from being like farmers out in that, and then like urban living, like let's build apartments, not like neighborhoods. So it's this incredible, super compact urban environment, so it makes sense to be able to study it archaeologically all spread out, right, as a city, not as an individual apartment. But that means having this tent over it is kind of like having a greenhouse built on top of your archaeological site, and it's still in the water table. Even though it's the desert, you're still getting that moisture up from the bottom, and it'll always be happening forever, so your new evaporation surface is the really interesting archaeology that you want to preserve. So it's a constant game of using syringes to inject any little holes that start to pull up, and be very, very careful about checking for salts, and then checking to see if they're still insoluble salts, and we can maybe get rid of a few of them. And if they're soluble salts, maybe we can get rid of a few of those. So it's a constant sort of maintenance babysitting of this in situ environment where you've just made kind of a humid greenhouse in the middle of a desert. But it is important for that to stay all together and all open from that big scope from a research perspective, so that's my job. We also did a little bit of experimental archaeology. I think it was kind of an excuse to set things on fire. But Chapelhoek was abandoned, and there's just this burn layer, and we just never have anything really interesting or cool happening above that. So that urban civilization, a fire went down in that city, stuff happened, and it was never really rebuilt, repopulated to the same degree ever again. So this burn layer is our important like before and after moments in this city's history. And how do these packed together apartments burn? Like, how does this forensic situation happen? So we built a little model of it, and we lit it on fire, and we had a really good time that night. And then the next day, we looked at it very, very carefully, took lots of pictures. All right, so other things. Cellulose nitrate. Remember that word for when we get to Afghanistan. When you keep things hot and dry, the object is stable. So that whole put it in a museum and it gets all like sweaty from the air conditioning, like a can of soda that gets really wet on the outside. So we keep things hot and dry. So at the Chapelhoek Museum, stuff stays in that sort of desert environment. At least the sun's not beating on you, so when you walk inside, it like feels really nice, but it's still like 92 degrees. But your museum materials don't behave properly. So something like paraloid B72, Bryce, it's safe because Champy's not going outside. It has a glass transition temperature of about 95, 100 degrees. That means that this hard adhesive just melts in the heat. So if you put together these objects that have hundreds of pieces to them, like this jaw, with paraloid B72, which is what we use at the museums for everything because it's so nice and so stable and it comes down with acetone so easily for at least a century because we've been materials testing it for that long. But it's not going to work in the heat. So cellulose nitrate is an old-fashioned 1840s kind of plant-based adhesive that works just fine. It yellows and it gets a bit brittle over time, but it's better than melting. So we like to use that in the desert instead. And finally, Rapa Nui. I was just a normal archaeologist on this particular expedition in like 2003. But it taught me about trying to work on a field project on the most remote island that's inhabited on the planet. A simple measuring tape, if you like forget that on your site and leave it outside and it rains and you come back tomorrow and it's rusted or somebody stepped on it and it's broken, there is not another one, right? So when you pack into somewhere extremely remote like Rapa Nui, you have to bring the right materials because you have to pack light, but you have to pack real smart. And you have to take care of even the simplest, dumbest things like pencils and tape measures, because when all of those are broken, the research ends and the trip's a failure, right? So just being so careful about what's in the pack and not having anything that you're not really super probably gonna need, but also making sure that you have everything you need, because there is no picking something else up. So, extreme environments, this all meant the objects, and then we get to Mezzainek. So here we are, the objects, they're just in the desert, up in the mountains, so it's arid, it's dry, it's high altitude, but the actual work is a little bit more complicated for the archaeologists. All right, so instead of a box, Sarah, I put a star, and I tried to make it like purple. We've got Kabul, Afghanistan is right there. I really like this map because you can see sort of the languages spoken in each of these areas. So this is Afghanistan. Kabul is that circle there. The little star is where Mezzainek is. It's right on the Afghan-Pakistani border. The Khan corridor here is that little finger, and that's the border with China, which is perpetually closed because China's like, security, we like it, go away. So we have this very remote, up in the mountains, border spot. We've got a little bit of aerial, I tried to keep the brownish gray archaeological objects, there's like 5, just 5. So we've got some aerial photography here, and you can see a lot of the city up on the edge of the mountain there. And the mountain locally is called Koinek, which means copper mountain. Mezzainek just means like little copper spot. So why are we doing this emergency archaeology? Because China has purchased the copper mining rights to strip mine this area from Afghanistan for I think 30 years. And it may or may not be the second largest copper source on planet Earth. It's certainly in the top 4. But there happens to be a 4th century Buddhist monastery complex and city on top of it. So it's great that who could have possibly known that these two things are, the local language is so built in with Mezzainek, little copper source, Koinek, it's Copper Mountain. We won't have that many Pashtun lessons in here, maybe like 5 or 6 more words, but it's amazing when you think about just asking somebody who lives down there. They probably know a lot more than a lot of your like desk-based analysis guys who have been looking at this stuff for months. Ask the farmer who's like, oh yeah, there's a Buddhist monastery site over there. We call it the Hill of the Infidel. It's true. So the copper is just coming out of the ground in the water table so amazingly. I just found like a sheep bone while I was walking around, and it's bright green, like a penny. This dude, we've got theories. But this is in one of the temples. The altar here, known as a stupa, in the center of the room, and just this dude on the floor, and he is bright green. So any of the bones, any of the porous material is bright green, and it's full of copper. And has all of the rusty, corrody issues of metal, along with all of the deterioration issues of bone and organic objects. Sounds complicated, and it makes me very happy. All right, here we are at Kafirya Tepe, Hill of the Infidel, and that is my camp. So this is our conservation lab over here. This is not where we live, this is where I did my work. This is the highly scientific, technological laboratory. So now you see we're dealing with altitude, desert, remote, isolated, low tech, except for what I brought in my luggage. So I've been preparing for this by accident for decades before I got this job. All right, so back up on Koinek, you can see that we've got a little bit of a sneak peek to this conflict zone. These vertical lines that are running up and down the mountain, and a little bit over here, those are geological survey trenches that were done in the 80s. And I think it was Soviet geological research happening that turned into the Mujahideen conflict of the 80s. So this is also a site of many, many battles, and to sort of neutralize the fact that terrorist attacks were happening, battles happened between these Soviet geologists and local, I'm gonna have to say terrorist groups. I know a lot of these guys, they are old men now, but the things they did in the 80s, freedom fighter, terrorist, it really depends on like retrospect in history, I guess. But they dropped a ton of anti-personnel landmines all over this just to sort of stop human movement through here. So we've got all these little tiny butterfly mines that are meant to take off the leg that have just been peppered on here out of airplanes. All right, now the Buddhist monastery. This incredible thing is on the end of the mountain here, and it's got such an interesting position that it is a fortified Buddhist monastery. You don't really think of Buddhists and like militarism. It's the only fortified Buddhist architecture ever found anywhere at any time. So it's incredibly important, and it also gives us a hint that, 1600 years ago must have been a pretty rough frontier even for the Buddhist monks for them to have fortified these temples. And up here on the end of the mountain, it's an incredible strategic spot. So this is me standing up there at the top of the mountain and looking at Pakistan. So you see that we've got the mountain range there, and the white bits, the snowy bits, are Pakistan. So you can see for miles and miles and miles in every direction. It's an incredibly militaristically strategic position for a Buddhist monastery. And the geologic survey trenches in the 80s just sort of blew right through the middle of the temple. So this is one of those altars, and a holy relic is usually in the middle, and instead this time we can just like walk through it because it's air and sunshine. Here's one of Roberta's beautiful maps that she made for me. And you can see some of these geologic trenches running through the middle of the temple. And all of those different symbols and colors are statues. Weather-wise, we had sandstorms a lot. It's very dry, it's very windy, high altitude, hot summers, cold winters. This was kind of an incredible one. It wasn't a sandstorm to start with, but then we had that heavy equipment out there and the dust was flying and it just kind of like got caught between the peaks of the mountains, and it was intense. And it snows a lot. Winter, we still work 6 days a week, even when it's piled with snow. Our guys come out and they just start like shoveling snow, and then we start digging some more. Also, Ramadan, we've got like a month of nobody eats or drinks except for like 10 p.m. to 4 a.m. And that's in the middle of the summer when it's 100 degrees. So, extreme environment, certainly for the objects, but also for the archaeologists. Back to the remote, this is our local grocery store in Zaidabad. It's the meat section. And here's our kitchen. So out at Kafuri Tepe, where my lab was, we also had guys cooking in 50-gallon drums, and they could do amazing things. Thanksgiving. That was my Thanksgiving feast. I was really excited that they were like, oh yeah, turkeys, we've got those. And then when they were like, your turkeys have arrived, they just like rolled open the van and opened the door, and these two jumped out. So I made American Thanksgiving dinner for everybody. They really liked the sweet potato pie. Christmas with our Charlie Brown Christmas tree. So very remote, very isolated. Back to that sort of security issue thing. There are signs everywhere to show you kind of what the different types of landmines look like that are being found there. We have deminers, and so they go around and they sweep. And I always think, like, from the movies, you've got those guys with the like super reinforced vests, and they've got those like metal detector things. It's a bunch of dudes in flip-flops, and when somebody finds like a butterfly mine, it's like, do you think it's active? They just like pick up a rock, step back a little bit, throw it at it. Okay. So we're constantly dealing with anti-personnel and anti-tank landmines everywhere. The deminers did incredible work, but it was a constant struggle on top of the archaeological work. We had daily flyovers. This one's our NATO guys, so we just sort of wave. We also have drones. Some of them we had no idea who they were, and they'd come in the middle of the night and like look in our windows and stuff. It was wild. Remember the one that had like the column, like poofy little air, and we all came outside, and I'm sure there's just like video to some country somewhere of all of these archaeologists in our pajamas at like 2 a.m. going like this as it's taking our picture. So we were constantly being monitored by heaven knows whom during our work. The Afghan police and the Afghan National Army were our only security and defense, and they're also maybe 20% Taliban. So it was a struggle from a logistical perspective as well as we went. They took our security, I think, very seriously. We had escorts back and forth to Kabul. One of the commanders used to stop and buy Robbie and I little lemonades and stuff, but none for the men. It was just us. But there was also a deep mistrust between the foreigners and the military or the police. And so we'd have sort of random inspections and random sort of, I don't know, stop and searches, if you will, while we were trying to work on site. And we needed to accommodate those in order to sort of diffuse the mistrust and build the trust. And it only took time. The other word that I wanted to teach you is talashi, which I don't know what it means, but it always meant that everybody got a pat down and the car got ripped apart, and like it's something like search. But you say talashi, and everybody just put their hands out. So we had these probably about 6 times a day, like 3 checkpoints on our way to work every day and 3 checkpoints on our way out. So that's just kind of a little bit of, here's what I was getting into as the head of field conservation for objects on this project. So why on earth did I stay? This is the granite pillar in front of the National Museum of Afghanistan in Kabul. It's right next to the front door. And I promise I won't get too verklempt. But a nation stays alive when its culture stays alive. And this is the motto that they have in front of their museum. So them fighting to remember that they had a great and powerful heritage, they were a major player on the Silk Road, they've had thousands of years of a rich, wonderful history and culture that needs to be remembered and preserved. They aren't just the guys that we've all been fighting over their mining resources for the last 100 years or so. So it's a motto, but it's also a call to defend, it's a plea, and they take it just as seriously as we do. In fact, many of our Afghan colleagues, the Taliban know who they are, and they get directly threatened. One of my colleagues at the museum in Kabul, his uncle was just like, if you come home for Ramadan, we will murder you. So he doesn't get to go home and see his family anymore because he's dedicated his life to the Buddhist heritage preservation. So, back to Kafiri Tepe. How do you be successful in a field project like this? Here, Kafiri Tepe is excavated, so you can see some of these magnificent Buddhas, our little Kafiria, if you will. And then that's our lab down there at the bottom of the hill. So, preservation. We worked with what we had to provide treatments for the objects. And I hear some of you maybe say like, oh my God, you've got food and tea near the objects? Yeah, but you know what the real amazing thing is? I'm near the objects. Do you know how long it took before I was actually able to just do my job? I went the first day and was like, here's the chemicals I need, and here's what I need to be able to do this, this, and this, and here are the materials. And they're like, cute, nice to meet you, please leave. I was like, oh, okay. So I had to negotiate with these Afghan conservators for weeks before they would let me have access to the chemicals that my company that I worked for bought them. I could either be mad about it, like the previous conservator who was no longer there, so we see how successful that went, or I could work on that trust, because Pashtun culture is much more relational, it's much more tribal, it's much more, I need to know you and trust you in order to work with you. And so it's one thing that I think they like to troll Westerners, that you show up for a meeting that's supposed to be about X, and you have tea for like 3 hours, and you talk about your families, and then they're like, well, it was nice to meet you, bye-bye. No business gets done, you didn't, but a lot of business gets done. So if you can like not freak out that like the meeting didn't have its agenda and nothing got answered, like they'll probably answer half your agenda questions next time, maybe, as long as you're chill. So it's that recognizing that you are a guest in their country and you are a guest who is there to help preserve their culture, but it's at their pleasure, right? It's not your way. So making sure that I was part of the trust building and doing it their way is how I started to be very successful at having access to the materials. Also, nobody spoke English, and my Dari was very poor when I got there. So we worked on it. All right, so getting to some of the cool objects. Once we got in there, small finds. Small finds can be cleaned on site. So in those corrugated tin shipping containers that were the laboratory, we would sit and we would clean the objects. And then they would be moved to the Kabul Museum by military escort. So that's pretty standard of small finds, clean, stabilize, package up, move to the museum, works like a normal place. Except that we didn't have access to basic things like adhesives. We'd gotten all the solvents that I ordered, acetone, ethanol, toluene, that was fine. Like, toluene's kind of carcinogenic. I was a little worried about that one. They're like, gallons, no problem. The cellulose nitrate that I had ordered to accompany it, so you could actually make glue out of the solvents, it sounded like nitrocellulose, which is a component in explosives, and they were like, no ma'am. So I spent a long time trying to explain that like a pirate and a pilot are not the same thing, just because the names are kind of similar. And I sent like, this is what cellulose nitrate looks like as a chemical formula. This is what nitrocellulose looks like. They're very different. One's a plant that makes glue. One of them blows things up. Didn't matter. Didn't matter. So after that was a hill that I was either going to die on or abandon, I went like, can I have some parallel B48N? And they were like, sure. Why I didn't think of that like day 2, I don't know. But once again, if I was talking to a room full of conservators, the fact that I'm working on stone objects down here, which by the way are packed in sheep's wool, use what you got, and ceramics, and I'm using parallel B48N, that's for metal. That's like a steel adhesive. Like, but it doesn't melt outside and it does the job. You just have to add less solvent so it doesn't get quite so runny and get into these porous materials. So you work with what you got, right? All right, excavating and moving bigger objects. I'm going from small objects to like getting to creative bigger object situations. These 2 vessels, they were buried into the floor layer here. So in the floor we found these cool like vessel lids, got a little sample sondage action in there, and it was like, nope, this is a whole giant pot that got buried in the floor. And we're like, treasure. Probably like grain. It was like the flour and bread storage, but you know, that's still treasure. These were at the top of the mountain. So we got them excavated. They were in really good shape. How do I get them down the mountain? Bed sheets and sticks. And then. So we walked them down the mountain as if it was like first aid if somebody broke their leg out hiking. And it worked really well. And so that was kind of one of those, you tend to leave the soil on the inside so that you can micro-excavate it in a lab, so that you can keep it stable and doesn't have, but all of that soil in a vessel this big, like now it's many hundreds of pounds heavier than it could be if we didn't do that. So, sampling in layers as we took the soil out to sort of reduce the weight so that these 4 poor guys could get it down there with the bed sheets and sticks. It was navigating that without doing it poorly, without breaking or damaging the object, and without losing that research material that was inside the object. I still had to find a creative way to make it happen with like rocks and sticks and bedding. And by the way, I saw this in town, this dude riding on this with a pickup truck, and so they still use these giant vessels for grain storage, and they still just, it stays cool and pretty, like it's like a refrigerator, it's like a pantry. So they still manufacture these, this is a brand new one, and it gets dug into the floor in the kitchen, and then buried down to floor level, and it's just, you're like, scoop it out. So nothing has changed, and I kind of love when you have those moments of cultural, hey, it works, it's low tech, but it works, so it's still working. Some of them did contain treasure, so I did want to be like, hey, look, we found some gold. We had some of this wealth in here, and what is really tantalizing is you've got these Buddhist monasteries, and then you've got this city in the center, and it's on the Silk Route. And when we get to some of the statues, you'll see that there's Greek influence, there's Hindu-Indian influence, there's Chinese influence, Gandharan influence. You've got all of these art cultures, which means trade and money and ideas and languages and stuff is moving through this place. There's a copper mine that the ancient people were using. They were minting coins. We found a bank, we assume, down in the city. So these are rich monks with fortifications. Like, this place is strange. And we got these little hints that there's this subterranean tunnel system. And there's little peaks of it in different buildings that we were finding. And it wasn't like an NDSU where you got those big ones you can like walk into in Pioneer Hall and stuff, but they were big enough that you could maybe store and move wealth. Maybe not people. I don't think it was like a subway system for pedestrians, but there was this tunnel system, and you get these hints that it would move out of the building, so it wasn't like some weird basement thing, and it would move out. And then it'd be in an area that was either destroyed or we hadn't been able to excavate yet. And then you'd see another one down in the city, and it was kind of headed that way. So this subterranean tunnel system under this very wealthy, very fortified, very busy silk trade route outpost is so interesting and exciting. And please don't get your hopes up. We had to abandon the site due to political issues for now. I don't know what's happening in those tunnels. I don't know if there's a lot more of that, a lot more information, a lot more stuff, and just than we would know. So I don't know what the tunnels do. Nobody does yet, but it's a yet. So that whole work with low tech, sticks and bench sheets, like I'm into it, but we have technology because when you pack in, you have to pack in light, but you have to pack in smart, right? So we had drones for photography. We didn't get to like bring one, but we were allowed to have some French drone photographers come and do the site. Our geomatics expert had some notes on their work, but at least we have it. Low tech, we have speed grid over there, which I don't know if that's familiar to other dirt nerds, but a meter by meter square, and then you string it every 10 centimeters, and you can just like slap it down and do a meter sketch out of what you're looking at like really fast. You know, like when you're a kid and they have those like, draw this like this, and it's got the little grid and you just match it up, like boom. And we had a total station, and we were keeping GIS data as well. So marrying those hand-drawn maps of the archaeology with this geomatic information was a way that we were able to preserve and rescue this site through documentation, even if we don't have access to it anymore. But since we spent all the money on the fancy mapping stuff and the drones to come over, I was back to like cardboard, insulation foam, bed sheets, and lumber. So we've got these statues here, and they are getting towards that medium-large zone. We looked at those block lifts from the Museum of London earlier, and we're kind of trying to create basically the same thing. We've got some expanding polyurethane housing foam. We got some cardboard boxes we cut up. We got some plaster of Paris bandages, like when you break your arm and get an old-fashioned cast. And we were able to start building pretty solid block lift supports for these large mud statues. And then once we get them all supported out, we can then cut them off the side of the wall, turn them, and get them transported to cobble where more consolidation on the back can happen. They can actually go on display at the National Museum. But they are dirt on dirt. So excavating these, They're made of the same mud. I don't know if you can see, here's a fallen statue, there's a shoulder, working on a head right there. They are mud, made of the same mud that the wall is made of, and all you have is this maybe millimeter thick layer of paint. And that is what you're excavating. You're finding this millimeter thick layer of paint with your little bamboo skewers, which I use the ones that you make church kebabs out of, where you get like 100 for $1. Those are like my surgical instruments. One of them, a lot of bamboo skewers, and you're like micro excavating as fast as you can. And just to sort of add to the urgency of it, our workmen are wonderful. Many of them have sacrificed very much to be working on this Buddhist heritage site. We also have guys that this is the only job that pays as well as it does, and they do what they do, but they still don't believe that you should have idols of people. So even some of our policemen who are security, stuff happens, and if a head gets left on site, you come back tomorrow, it's been smashed up. So if you find a Buddha head, you have today, or it's gone forever. So I was in these sort of very urgent situations, although we had some more nuanced and delicate archaeologists who they'd see curls, that like stylized curl of a Buddha, and they'd just kind of like kick some dust over it and be like, it's tomorrow at 6 a.m. because it's 2:30 and this is not gonna happen today, right? So they could time it a little better, and then at dinner be like, what you doing tomorrow? I'm like, probably whatever you're gonna tell me right now. Yeah. So we had this sort of tension that we were working under for that as well. I love the differences in the styles that we can see that are these Silk Road influences. Many of the heads, by the way, were separated and put at the feet of the statues, deliberately, at some point historically. Some of them were fallen, like we just saw, but some of them, many of them, we only have to about waist height because just the building has been eroded over time, but we have the heads because the heads were stuck at the feet. So there's some indication there, there's this kind of theory hint that if you're gonna leave a sacred space, like a church or something, you take down your most sacred altar things. Like if a cathedral's gonna turn into a nightclub, and you've already done the thing and you've sold it, what do you take to make that okay in that space, right? How do you de-sanctify it? And I think that is what was happening with a lot of these Buddhas, that if they took the heads off, put them at the feet, and kind of undid that sacred altar space, they could abandon the site. The green dude is the only body we found, so there was some orderly abandonment to this place. But of course, these stupa altars are everywhere on site, and they are small, medium, large. They're all very beautiful, very well decorated, and they also had to be abandoned, and there's no sort of way to de-sanctify an altar, right? So, moving larger pieces. We're getting bigger, larger than life. We had to move these in the same way as a block lift, but again, the bigger you get, the heavier it is, and my technology is bed sheets and dudes and sticks. So we had to do a lot more excavation here than I would have been comfortable with in any other situation. Normally, you try and get a solid distance out there and bring plenty of it back to the lab, where you have all the time in the world, in a nice, friendly environment. Instead, we have like today and right now, and as quickly as possible with dudes. Which brings me to the mega stupas. There are many of them that are like the size of 2 school buses parked next to each other, but they're made of solid rock. Like they're dry stone, layered altars. When I got there, the plan was, let's airlift them with helicopters. I spent a lot of time having to explain how air works in a lot of buildings and offices. It was like a year of being like, but what about the helicopters? I'm like, do you know what altitude we're at? Do you know how much helicopters can lift? And do you know how much they can lift? They can't lift themselves off the ground up here. So, sad to say that all I could manage to do was like break the heart of the helicopter enthusiasts at the ministry, but really couldn't get another plan. My plan, and if someone wants to steal it and go be the head of conservation and the hero that's on the cover of National Geographic, I'll just be happy that this got out of here, but I think this would work. The Berlin Museum, back in World War, never mind, it doesn't matter, they took the Gate of Ishtar in Iraq, in Baghdad, and moved it to Berlin. And they did it one brick at a time. They labeled them all, and then they took it apart like a little puzzle, and then they just put it all back together, one brick at a time, all labeled. It's really easy to move a brick, and you can move a whole building. So mapping this, labeling it, taking it apart, and putting it back together again in a location, like, you can move 100 pounds of stuff. I see my guys do it every day. So chunking it out in sections, breaking it up into a jigsaw puzzle that's well labeled, and moving it off the mountain, I hope that happens at some point soon. I didn't copyright it, I just want to see it happen. But what about the really, really, really big things? Nothing that we have there is gonna work. The math is hard for really big mud statues attached to a wall. Lovingly, I mean, the math is easy, just the answer is always, it will break. So we need heavier equipment, we need more sophisticated materials, and we need time to be able to move something like this. So the success that I had to share with you as I move towards the fails is that I was able to say yes and move and protect and I guess rescue more objects from Mezainek by having trained on what to bring. What if you only have 2 pieces of luggage? I came home for Christmas once, no. I came home once after I'd been there like 8 months. I was like, I should go see my family. And the crap I brought back, I brought those Harbor Freight like electric fly swatters. And like our kitchen dudes had a blast until those broke. I brought a glow-in-the-dark soccer ball back for the boys, and they could play till like midnight, even in the wintertime. So like, I think I used my luggage space wisely. But packing in, I was able to move more than had been moved before, but I still had the limit of these massive statues. And they're still there. And in any other context, this would very clearly be architecture. This would be, you don't move the cathedral, you go see the cathedral. But like, there aren't tourist visas to Afghanistan. It's in Logar province. My banker was from Logar. He's like, oh, yeah, I'm from Logar. I'm like, oh really, where do you live? Zayabad? And he's like, no, we moved to Kabul. Logar's way too dangerous. Like, Afghanis won't go to Logar. So how do we rescue this when we can't move it? We rescue it through preservation, through documentation, through the work we did, the research we did, the data collected, the photographs, all of those beautiful GIS maps that were made. We created enough research material that this place isn't gone, even if it's gone. So my heart has broken for Mezainek on the Afghan-Pakistani border mountains until I was at the International Council of Museums this past September, and one of our keynote speakers is from the Aga Khan Institute, which is just an incredibly well-funded Middle Eastern cultural heritage program. Privately funded by heaven knows who, but like probably the richest men in the world all got together and did this. And they have redone the souk at Aleppo. They have done incredible work that's just probably $1 billion kind of reconstruction project. And they're now at Mezainek doing some preservation on 060 up on the hill. That big fortified one at the end of the mountain, Kofiri Tepe, like my old lab, the Hill of the Infidels with those huge Buddhas. So work is being done right now, and it's being done by sort of local and neighboring governance that are private companies that can work with the Taliban successfully. And the pictures that they had, it was so wonderful to see. Some of the guys that I worked with are working on that project right now in 2024. And A, they're alive, which makes me very happy. But B, this work is being done. We have these moments where we can say this is all we can do. Salvage archaeology, you know that the whole point is you salvage what you can and then progress happens. But certainly in this conflict zone, it was preservation through documentation for as much as we could do, as long as we could do. Those were some of our ceramic washers. And that it's not over, right? That cultural survival has continued, even with all the bad news that you see on the news. Wonderful things are still happening at Mazainek. So I left this for the Q&A that you just got, random site pictures of our guys and camp and town, so that you can kind of get an idea of what it was like there where we lived. And it's a wonderful place full of wonderful people doing incredible things to preserve the heritage that they have, which was a rich and wonderful history that we just don't talk about as much because the news is busy with what's up right now, which is not as interesting. So, any questions for me?
Any theories on why they abandoned that site?
Because of that fortified nature and Silk Road trade, I'm teaching a class on that right now, Silk Route for art history. You know, Genghis Khan was one of the ones who sort of took over and like murdered millions of people, we remember, and then he realized people don't make you money if they're dead. So he was the scourge of the Silk Road for a hot decade or so until he was like, wait a minute, how about I run some sort of like mafia-style protection racket where I'm like, no, nobody's gonna hurt you. Please keep trading stuff and making money for a small tax. So these kinds of takeovers and controls of this area, because it was such a rich outpost, you know, it would get raided and sacked, and then they'd be like, oh crap, now they don't make money anymore. And then they'd help rebuild it, and then they'd deliberately protect it until the next guy had the stupid idea before they had the smart idea. So I think eventually, at some point, something like a Genghis Khan before you realize you don't make money with dead people situation happened up there, because it was abandoned with enough sort of orderly fashion, and we just really don't have a whole lot of occupation levels above this beautiful site that you're seeing here. Like it just wasn't a thing. And then there was a recent village where unfortunately a few hundred of our workmen actually lived on top of Mazainek, but it was kind of little encampments and things. So they had a little mud brick mosque that was, I don't know, the size of maybe 4 outhouses, and that was left. That was preserved. So we had a mosque on site, but that was it from the village. There was modern, kind of, sort of village on top that was removed, but...
Osama bin Laden used the caves.
That's right. There are caves right on and near site, and Osama bin Laden was living in one, and it's amazing.
The two towers, he was living in that.
An ICBM missile went into one of those, and all you can see is this beautiful, like, whoop, black line of smoke, and it was like, that thing was like laser point accuracy to have gone in that cave tunnel, and just, all we get is that, like, black soot line out. But you got that thermal heating happening in that area, so those caves are actually quite cozy. I never realized it. I don't. Yeah.
So I'm curious, you said that the motivation here was because the copper is going to be mined. Is that correct? Yeah.
Where are we at with that?
Well,
Yeah.
no, actually, the question I had is, I mean, copper mining would need big roads and probably heavy equipment.
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering, is it possible that some of that equipment could be used to help move your really large objects?
Maybe. So we're not all on the same page for what's going to happen there. The Chinese mining company actually built like a big miners camp with barracks, and they had these really big screen TVs. They had really nice stuff in there. I'm going to tell a terrible story, and I know we're being recorded, but it was in this like basin. So you're standing at the top of Khoai Nak, and like I showed you Pakistan, And then if you look behind you, there was this just like basin that they built this miners camp in, and it was just like so easy. So it got mortared and bombed and whatever. Like, it was just pot shot target practice for the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. So the place was never even populated. It was abandoned, but it was all set up. So my guys would go down there and like, they come out with like a big screen TV. It's like, where'd you get that? It's like, it's just laying down there. It's perfectly fine. It's like, can I have a TV? Yeah. I didn't have any like electricity to plug it into, but I was like, that's a nice television. So there was tension about the Chinese mining company even being there. They had started to build some roads, but they certainly hadn't built it imagining what it's like to try and be in a war zone. Our camp, on the other hand, had its back up against one of the higher peaks, and then the low basin in front of it is still absolutely just peppered with anti-personnel landmines. So there was no getting to us except from a distance. I mean, they tried. There were mortars in, tried to kill us in our sleep a few times, but it was harder than it worked. So the tension there is real. The Chinese mining project is on hold for now, and that's quite a difficult thing, because you can say like, yay, save man's neck, preservation, but doesn't Afghanistan deserve to have an economy? That was my passport photo.
She had Elvis black hair.
They deserve to have an economy, right? Like, they deserve to have some economic success, and certainly in London, for Museum of London Archaeological Services, we would have mitigated, we would have salvaged everything we needed, recorded everything, and then a wrecking ball would have come through and the parking garage would get built anyway, right? So certainly those of us who have dealt with rescue archaeology, we were fully prepared for that site to get destroyed. And now that there's a pause on that, I guess it's maybe for the best that the Taliban government doesn't get billions of dollars every year for that, but so yes, the tension is real. It's a dangerous place to work, and the Chinese setup was just like a really easy target, so it never got inhabited. So yeah.
I have a feelings question.
Yes.
So you've been in a lot of different places in the world, and as we progress in life as women, we kind of think we're this in our 20s, and we think we're this in our 40s, 30s, and 40s. How, if at all, did your kind of concept of your place in the world as a woman change before and after?
I think I wasn't a woman, I was a field archaeologist until I was in my 30s. This is my job. You can't have a boyfriend, a husband, friends that are, you know, like you don't have a life to do this. And I had done that for many, many years. So yeah, kind of that, you have to make the choice to settle down eventually. So I had a little kiddo and was like, oh my gosh, where do I raise them? I know, somewhere safe. And so I came home. So I'm like an extra helicopter mom because I know what the world's actually like.
So, but like in the context of the way that culturally women are seen differently in the different places that you've been in, how has that shaped your perception of your true self?
It's been interesting because I can navigate a lot of spaces. Sometimes it's exhausting, but you know, certainly working in Cairo, there's sort of three genders. There's like men, women, and then foreign women. So we're not held to the same cultural standards. So you don't dress like you're Egyptian. You dress like a Westerner. You're treated like a Westerner. So the fact that we worked and had workmen that had to answer to us was kind of culturally not as much of a problem. In Afghanistan, I had to wear a hijab all the time. Having women in the workplace is not something anybody is used to unless they're literally making tea and you never see them. Even when I'd be in the office, it's like, you get a little knock on the door, you open the door, there's a little tray with tea and it's all poured and everything. Like, they were like ninjas in the darkness. Like, I never saw them. But so everybody wanted to work with us, they just kind of had no idea how. So like socially navigating that was often very awkward. Like, but having to wear a hijab, having to sort of fit in that sense, like we couldn't drive. We couldn't, like, there's a lot that we couldn't do while we were trying to navigate being specialists and heads of workman groups and things. So, yeah, it was an interesting line, but I've gone back many times after the Mezzanette project. I worked for HADA, so I was at the National Museum of Afghanistan in Kabul, checking on projects until COVID. And my security guy once had the moment that kind of made me go, I'm getting too old for this, I'm over it, it was really cloudy, so I was wearing these instead of my sunglasses, and he was walking next to the car, bangs on the window, and I roll it down, he said, take your glasses off. I was like, what? He said, take your glasses off. Glasses on a woman, it's cute, like glasses on a dog, but serves no purpose. And I was like, and then I realized I'm giving away that I can read by wearing glasses, and that's not, so I was not blending in traffic by just wearing sunglasses. I was actually making our entire car full of people much more vulnerable by advertising that I'm a foreigner, that I can read, right? So it was him really trying to help us stay safe, but it was one of those moments of like, I am getting too old for this adventure. I only went back like twice after that. I'm done now.
You have no pictures of women in your slides.
Yeah, walking down the street occasionally. I've got, these fades are terrible. Yeah, so we wore hijabs, which is scarves on our heads, but the full burqa is very much part of the culture still. We've got, those are dudes wearing their blanket/coats. Didn't we have some women? There we go. So women in burqas, traveling in packs. I always had to be accompanied. But yeah, it's a very different way to navigate space, even though you're sort of only pretending when you're outside getting from point A to point B that you fit in. And then the rest of the time you're kind of trying to run your Western professional life.
Can I give an anecdote? I'm the mother. That's why I have gray hair. She was in an international camp, and when she got there, there were Germans and Dutch and, people from
Italians.
Italian. Supposed to be international camp. And I'm sitting at my desk at my office, and Messenger comes up. I only ever had Messenger because she had to check in with me. But she's so high. And I open it up, and it's a voice coming from Kabul, Habib, who says, "Woman, your daughter took off her scarf. You call her now."
My HR guy called my mother because my scarf was not like
Her
tight
scarf
enough.
was
I was
missing,
just like,
and she was her hair was starting to grow out, and you could see blonde roots. So he called me in the middle of the day in Minot, North Dakota, I don't even know how that happened, to tell me to call her and tell her to put a scarf on. So they were watching her all the time. And I don't know how many knew she was American, because she had just come from England, so she still was a little,
everybody. Like we had, I was like, I'm Canadian. And they'd be like, I gotta move that a little bit.
But that's how close they were watching, that I got the call that her scarf flew off, and then the time you changed the tire during Ramadan. In Kabul. They couldn't eat or drink.
We had a flat tire. It was 100 degrees. My driver like picked up the tire iron like, and I was like, I had a Snicker bar right before you picked me up. Like, let's do this. So I was trying to get the tire, and it kept catching my scarf and pulling it. So it was the most awkward. I had a crowd around me being like, what is this crazy woman jacking up a car? Like, finally a man in the crowd took pity on me and like finished the job. But yeah, it was
So
quite the sight.
right in front of the embassy, Rome, which is the most dangerous place in the world, right? She takes her scarf off to fix a tire.
I didn't take it off.
Habib was nervous. That's all I can see.
Got a question in the back?
I got a question. So, do you guys have any theory how the Buddhist temple actually got there? Because I'm not sure that the region, has it always been Buddhist? It's not really.
Yes, Buddhism spread into that area of Afghanistan really early. And I don't know if I can get back like 40 slides, but imagine the map. That little finger of the walk-on corridor is actually quite passable, certainly historically. So Asian religious and ideology and philosophy influence really spread into that area of Eastern Afghanistan quite early in the Buddhist movement. So yeah, it really flourished in that area for several centuries.
And now it's just completely gone, I imagine? Or
Yeah, it was amazing when we got the demographic info of like, it's 99.98% Muslim, and then they're naming like 0.02% Christian, and then they're like, there's one Jew, his name is blah, 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 he lives in Kabul. You're like, wow, okay, like, pretty good homogenous.
Do you have any bucket list archaeological dig sites that you would either like to visit or, if you could, do work at?
I had like a midlife crisis at 27 because I was like, I worked at the pyramids of Egypt, I worked at Easter Island and Rapa Nui, and then I was walking around site at Çatalhöyük like a month in, and I called my mom and I'm like, these are the 3 greatest current archaeological projects like on planet Earth, like what do I do now? And she's like, chill out. Like, I've peaked, and now let's go for it. So, I think what I really love now that I'm just sort of like the old lady rocking on the porch being like, oh kids, let me tell you how it is out there. I actually do a lot of consulting for projects happening all over the world. So I'm kind of command and control base that progress can call me. 2019, there was a plan to go to the North Pole because some of the ice sheets are melting and material is coming out of them. So I got kind of a soft call of, hey, you do organic objects in extreme environments? I'm like, yes, I do. And ended up working for this project just through Zoom calls, talking to them about what they're probably gonna find, what they need to pack in for that project, and how to be able to preserve wood, bone, leather, feathers, tissue, skin, you know, frozen permafrost bog body things. So I was able to work for that project, use all of my knowledge and experience from all the decades, but like get to like hang up and be in my climate controlled room and like fix dinner that I actually want, you know. So it's been really nice to be able to sort of pop in and work on a lot of projects all over the world from Minot.
I have a tea question.
Hit me.
Okay, so you're a sommelier.
Yes.
And you have drank a lot of tea, like in all the places that you've been. And these are like some tea places.
These are some tea
London,
places.
Afghanistan. So do we have access to in Minot, North Dakota, that is like your highest tea recommendation?
Roberta just bought a box of tea for us from London.
Oh, okay. Very nice.
Yeah, but from London.
I think it's funny because like Turkey, they do sage tea. And it's very similar to the sort of Native American sage teas that we get around here. So like I smell it and it takes me back to like South Turkish desert. So that's a favorite with a little bit of honey. And just boiling up and steeping mint leaves is a big thing. And a hot boiling cup of mint tea on a hot boiling day is weirdly quite refreshing.
And 4 fingers of sugar.
Yes, yeah, there's just sediment under there, yeah. It really picks you up in the middle of the day.
They'll give you this glass with like 4 fingers of sugar in it. It's like, oh, you drink this.
It's an energy drink.
Any other questions?
Yeah, I'm looking at all the blue eyes on a lot of these.
Yeah.
Thank you, Alexander the Great and the Macedonian Empire. I guess that's one thing about how culture continues. There are different sort of ethnic subgroups that have stayed together in these tribal areas, and so Genghis Khan's Mongol horde rape victim survivors all ended up kind of staying together in an area, and if your father is half Mongolian and your mother's half Mongolian, you're half Mongolian. So centuries later, you have the Hazara people who are half Mongolian, but they are native to Afghanistan. And we've got Alexander the Great's whole bunch of blue-eyed Afghanis because they kind of stay in the same sort of tribal regions. So you've got different culture, a little bit language dialects, dress, really staying in these kind of isolated pockets where you can point to history by looking at a blonde-haired, green-eyed Afghan and be like, all right, Macedonians, wow. So yeah, it's pretty incredible.
I can walk the Vegas Strip and pick out a North Dakotan like this.
Right?
Yeah. Yep, I know my people. Yeah.
Any last questions? All right, let's thank our there's a little bit more cookies and cupcakes down here on the way out. Make sure to grab something. Tomorrow night in this same room, we're going to have our second speaker in the series. Roberta Marziani is going to be talking about some VR work. It's very exciting. She's also going to have an Oculus device with her. So you'll be able to put that on your face and get an immersive 3D environment. So we're going to have that set up before and after the talk. So if you want to come a little bit early tomorrow, maybe 30, 45 minutes early, we'll have that set up so we can do a demo before. And then after her talk, we'll also do a demo after. So if you didn't get a chance to come early, stay a little bit late and you'll be able to see some of that stuff as well. So hope to see you both tomorrow and Friday, and thanks a lot for coming.
Thanks for coming.
I'm glad we have that.